A father places a camera in his daughter's coffin, and what he saw left him stunned. Ethan had always been the kind of man people relied on. He was steady, dependable, and rarely shaken by life's curveballs. But losing his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, was a blow he couldn't recover from. The world felt darker, heavier, like the joy had been drained from every corner of his life. Lily wasn't just his daughter, she was his everything. Her laughter filled the house like sunshine on a cold winter morning, and her curious mind turned even the simplest moments into adventures. Whether she was begging him to push her higher on the swings, or asking him why the stars twinkled, she made every day worth living. Ethan had built his life around her, and now, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The accident had been so sudden, so inexplicable. It happened on an ordinary afternoon at the park. One moment she was running across the field with her friends, her ponytail bouncing in the wind. The next, Ethan received a call that no parent should ever have to take. Lily had fallen and hit her head. Paramedics said it was a freak accident, the kind no one could predict or prevent. By the time he reached the hospital, she was already gone. The funeral was an unbearable blur. Friends and relatives filled the small chapel, offering their condolences, but their words felt hollow. Ethan barely heard them. His focus was entirely on the small white coffin at the front of the room. As he approached it, he felt his chest tighten. There she was, his little girl, lying so still. She looked more peaceful than he'd ever seen her in life, her hands folded neatly over her favorite stuffed bunny. For a moment, Ethan almost believed she was only sleeping. But something didn't sit right. His grief was overwhelming, yes, but there was also something else, a nagging feeling that he couldn't explain. It was a gut instinct, a voice in the back of his mind whispering that this wasn't the end of her story. He tried to brush it off as part of his denial, but the sensation only grew stronger as the night went on. Rachel, his younger sister, stayed by his side the entire evening. She tried to comfort him, reminding him that Lily would want him to be strong. "She's at peace now, Ethan," Rachel whispered, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But Ethan couldn't respond. How could Lily be at peace when he wasn't? How could a vibrant, healthy child be gone so suddenly, with no explanation that made sense? That night, as the guests left and the house fell into silence, Ethan found himself pacing back and forth in the living room. His thoughts were racing. He replayed the accident in his mind over and over, trying to spot something he'd missed, anything to make it make sense. But no matter how hard he tried, the pieces didn't fit. Then an idea struck him. It was absurd, irrational, even intrusive, but it felt like the only way to calm the storm inside his head. He would place a hidden camera inside Lily's coffin before it was buried. "What are you thinking, Ethan?" he muttered to himself as he dug through a drawer, searching for an old compact camera. He wasn't sure why he wanted to do it. Closure, maybe, or proof that she was truly gone. Or perhaps he just couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, Ethan carefully positioned the small device in Lily's coffin. His hands trembled as he adjusted the angle, making sure it wouldn't be noticed. Guilt gnawed at him. What if someone found out? What if this was disrespectful to Lily's memory? But his desperation outweighed his doubts. He needed answers, answers that no one else seemed to have. As he closed the lid, sealing the camera inside, he felt an overwhelming wave of unease. What was he expecting to see? He didn't know. All he knew was that he wouldn't be able to sleep until he understood why his heart refused to accept her death. That night, Ethan lay in bed, his eyes glued to the ceiling. The house was eerily quiet without Lily's presence. He reached for the monitor that connected to the camera, but his fingers hesitated. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, as if saying it out loud would make it true. "I'll check it tomorrow." But deep down, he already knew that whatever the camera captured would change everything. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling restless. He'd barely slept, his mind trapped in a loop of grief and curiosity. What if the camera showed nothing? Would that bring him peace, or only deepen the void in his heart? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. As the hours passed, he kept putting it off. He cleaned the house, went through old photos of Lily, even tried to distract himself with a movie, but his eyes kept darting to the monitor on the desk. Finally, as the sun began to set, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, he turned on the device. At first, the screen showed only darkness. The camera's infrared mode barely lit up the interior of the coffin, casting everything in a dim, grainy glow. Ethan leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the monitor. He told himself not to expect anything. "It's just a coffin," he muttered under his breath. "Nothing's going to happen." But even as he said it, his stomach twisted with dread. And then, there it was, a shadow. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a flicker in the corner of the screen. Ethan blinked, convinced his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But then it happened again. This time, it was more pronounced. A faint movement across the frame, as if something inside the coffin had shifted. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. He leaned so close to the monitor that his nose almost touched the screen. His heart raced as he stared at the shadow, waiting for it to appear again. For a few moments, nothing happened. The screen remained still, silent. And then he heard it. A faint sound, so low he almost missed it. A rhythmic, shallow noise. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Breathing. Ethan froze, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he was hearing. This has to be interference, he thought, a technical glitch. He checked the camera settings, frantically pressing buttons, but everything seemed normal. The sound continued, steady and unmistakably human. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice growing louder. His hands were shaking now, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't look away from the screen. Then something moved again. This time, it wasn't subtle. The shadow shifted, unmistakably coming from within the coffin. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. Something or someone was inside with Lily's body. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed Rachel's number. His hands were so unsteady that he almost dropped it. "Ethan, what's going on?" Rachel's voice was calm, but the panic in his tone quickly alarmed her. "Rachel," he stammered, struggling to form the words. "You need to come over, right now. It's Lily. There's something in the coffin. I can't explain it. Just come." "What are you talking about?" Rachel asked, her voice rising with concern. "Ethan, you're not making sense. Please," he pleaded, "just trust me. You need to see this for yourself." Rachel hesitated for a moment, but the desperation in her brother's voice was enough to convince her. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said. Ethan hung up, his eyes glued to the monitor. The sound of breathing continued, steady and unnatural. He thought about turning off the device, but he couldn't. He had to know what was happening. When Rachel arrived, Ethan was pacing the living room, his face pale and his hands trembling. Without a word, he led her to the desk and pointed at the screen. "What am I looking at?" Rachel asked, squinting at the grainy footage. "Just watch," Ethan whispered. For a moment, Rachel saw nothing. The coffin was still, silent, as it should have been. But then the breathing returned, faint but unmistakable. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "Is that—" she began, but she couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but it's real." Rachel stared at the screen, her mind racing. This couldn't be possible. Lily was gone. They had buried her. She had seen it herself. And yet, the sound of breathing continued. "What do we do?" Rachel finally asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew there was only one way to find out the truth. They had to go back to the cemetery. The car ride to the cemetery was suffocating. Neither Ethan nor Rachel spoke much, their thoughts swirling in chaotic loops. The only sound in the car was the rumble of the engine and Rachel's nervous breaths. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We're crazy," Rachel finally muttered, staring out the window into the dark expanse of the road. "This is insane, Ethan. What are we even going to do if we find something?" Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have an answer, and the truth was, he didn't want to think about it. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore what they had seen. He had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. By the time they reached the cemetery, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the rows of headstones. The gates creaked as Ethan pushed them open, the sound cutting through the cold, still air like a warning. Rachel hesitated. "Maybe we should wait until morning," she said, her voice shaky. This doesn't feel right." "We can't wait," Ethan replied, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "If there's even the slightest chance that Lily's alive, I need to know now." He walked ahead, not waiting for Rachel to respond. She reluctantly followed, clutching her coat tightly against the chill in the air. As they approached Lily's grave, Ethan's heart pounded harder with every step. He carried a shovel he had grabbed from his garage, the weight of it feeling heavier with each passing moment. "This is insane," Rachel repeated, her voice trembling. "What if we're wrong? What if this is just grief messing with your mind?" Ethan stopped and turned to face her, his eyes filled with desperation. "If it's grief, then fine, but if it's not, if something's really happening, I need to know." Rachel swallowed hard and nodded, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. When they reached the grave, Ethan wasted no time. He thrust the shovel into the earth, the sound of metal striking dirt echoing in the stillness. Each movement was frantic, driven by a mix of fear and hope. Rachel stood back, her arms wrapped around herself, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to dance in the moonlight. "Ethan, stop," she finally said after several minutes. "This isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this." Ethan didn't answer. Sweat dripped down his brow despite the chill, and his breathing grew heavier with each strike of the shovel. The more dirt he removed, the closer he got to the truth, and the more his mind raced with possibilities he wasn't ready to face. Finally, the sound of the shovel hitting wood froze them both in place. Ethan dropped the tool and stared at the coffin below. "Are we really doing this?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan knelt down, his hands trembling as he wiped away the remaining dirt. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. "Help me open it," he said, his voice hoarse. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. "Ethan, no, we can't." "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I can't do this alone." After a long pause, Rachel nodded. Together they pried open the coffin, the creaking of the wood sending chills down their spines. When the lid finally gave way, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There she was, Lily, just as they had left her. Her body was still, her hands folded neatly over her favorite stuffed bunny. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, as Ethan leaned closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Lily's lips moved. It was subtle at first, a slight twitch that could have been his imagination. But then it happened again. A soft, shallow exhale escaped her mouth. "She's breathing," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with equal parts terror and hope. "No," Rachel replied, stepping back. "That's not possible. She's been buried for days." Before Ethan could respond, Lily's eyes fluttered open. They weren't the eyes he remembered, bright and full of life. These were cold, blank, and lifeless, staring straight ahead as if they could see through him. "Lily?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Her lips moved again, forming a single word, "Daddy." But the voice wasn't hers. It was deep, distorted, and layered with what sounded like a chorus of whispers. Rachel screamed, stumbling back as Ethan froze in place, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Suddenly, the air around them grew heavy, and a chilling breeze swept through the cemetery. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, as if alive. "We need to leave," Rachel said, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him back. "Now!" But Ethan couldn't move. His daughter, whatever was left of her, was right in front of him, and she wasn't alone. Ethan couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed as Lily's lifeless eyes stared through him. The word "Daddy" hung in the cold night air, but the voice wasn't hers. It was something unnatural, a guttural tone layered with whispers, like 100 voices speaking in unison. "Lily," Ethan whispered again, his voice trembling, desperate for an answer that wouldn't come. Suddenly, Lily's lips moved again, but this time they weren't forming words. Her mouth twisted unnaturally, opening wider than it should, as if something inside her was trying to force its way out. "Ethan, get away from her," Rachel screamed, pulling harder on his arm. Her voice snapped him out of his trance, and he stumbled back from the coffin. The air grew colder, almost suffocatingly so. Rachel clutched her coat tighter, her breath visible in the icy fog that was now surrounding them. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, whispers. They were coming from the coffin. "This isn't her," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Ethan, this isn't Lily." "No," Ethan replied, his voice cracking. "It's her. It has to be her. She's alive." But deep down, Ethan knew Rachel was right. The child in the coffin might have Lily's face, but the way her body moved, the lifelessness in her eyes, it wasn't her. As he stood frozen in disbelief, the whispers grew louder, and Lily's body began to twitch. Her hands, still clutching the stuffed bunny, shifted slightly, and her head turned toward Ethan in a jerky, unnatural motion. "We shouldn't have done this," Rachel muttered, backing away. "We never should have opened it." Lily, or the thing pretending to be her, suddenly sat up in the coffin. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as if her body was being controlled by invisible strings. Her head tilted to the side and her lips parted once more. "You should have let us rest." The voice was loud this time, echoing across the cemetery. Ethan and Rachel froze, their hearts pounding as the weight of those words sank in. "Us," Rachel whispered. "What does that mean? Who is us?" Before Ethan could respond, the earth around the grave began to tremble. Dirt shifted, cracks forming in the ground beneath their feet. The whispers turned into low, guttural groans that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Rachel, run!" Ethan shouted, snapping out of his shock. But as they turned to flee, a shadowy figure began to rise from the coffin. It wasn't Lily anymore. It was something else entirely. The figure was tall and distorted, its body shrouded in darkness that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes glowed faintly, empty and menacing, as it fixed its gaze on Ethan. The shadow spoke, its voice a bone-chilling blend of rage and sorrow. "You disturbed our rest. Now you will pay the price." Ethan grabbed Rachel's hand, and they sprinted toward the cemetery gates. The ground shook beneath them, making each step harder than the last. Behind them, the shadow grew larger, its form twisting and writhing as if it were pulling strength from the night itself. "Don't look back!" Rachel screamed, but Ethan couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The shadow was following them, moving unnaturally fast, its smoky tendrils reaching out as if trying to pull them back. And in the center of it all, he could still see Lily's face, her blank eyes staring at him, pleading silently. When they finally reached the gates, they slammed them shut behind them, gasping for air. But the whispers didn't stop. The cold lingered, and the oppressive feeling of being watched was unbearable. What the hell was that?" Rachel panted, leaning against the gate for support. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was reeling, torn between the horror of what he'd just seen and the overwhelming guilt of having disturbed his daughter's grave. "We need help," Rachel said finally, her voice trembling. "We can't handle this alone. Whatever that was, it's not just about Lily. It's something bigger." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the cemetery. He couldn't shake the image of Lily's face from his mind, or the words that thing had spoken. "You should have let us rest." "Who do we call?" he asked, his voice hollow. Rachel hesitated, then said, "There's someone who might know what to do. Father Michael. He's dealt with strange things before." Ethan didn't argue. At this point, he was willing to do anything to save his daughter, or whatever was left of her. But as they drove away from the cemetery, the whispers didn't leave them. They clung to the edges of their minds, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely. And Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Ethan and Rachel arrived at St. Mark's Church just before dawn. The old building loomed in the pale morning light, its towering steeple casting long shadows across the cobblestone path. Rachel could barely steady her hands as she knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Do you think he'll believe us?" Rachel whispered, glancing nervously at Ethan. "He has to," Ethan replied, his voice low and raw. "If he doesn't, I don't know what we'll do." The door creaked open, revealing Father Michael, an older man with piercing eyes and a presence that was both calming and intimidating. He immediately noticed their disheveled state. Rachel's tear-streaked face, Ethan's trembling hands, the sheer terror in their eyes. "What happened?" Father Michael asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan hesitated, unsure where to begin. Rachel stepped forward, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It's my niece, Lily. We buried her, but something happened. She's not resting. And now there's something dark." Father Michael's expression didn't change. He simply stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. "Come in," he said. "We need to talk." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, and the faint glow of candlelight flickered against the stone walls. Father Michael led them to a small study where he gestured for them to sit. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me everything." Father Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense. "There are forces, old restless forces, that can attach themselves to the living and the dead. Sometimes they're drawn to grief, anger, or despair. It's possible that something has latched onto your daughter, using her to anchor itself to this world." Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. But why? Why her? "Spirits like these are opportunistic," Father Michael explained. "They seek weakness, vulnerability. A child's death, especially one so sudden, creates a crack, a doorway, if you will. If this entity has been disturbed, it won't let go easily." Rachel buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled as she asked, "Can we stop it?" "Yes," Father Michael said firmly, "but it won't be easy. This isn't just about freeing Lily's body. It's about severing the connection entirely, ensuring this spirit can't use her as a vessel again." Ethan leaned forward, desperation etched into his face. "Tell us what to do. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Father Michael rose from his chair and walked to a shelf filled with old leather-bound books. He pulled one out and flipped through its yellowed pages, stopping at a passage written in faded Latin. "We'll need to return to the grave," he said, his tone somber. "At night. That's when the spirit will be strongest, but it's also when it's most vulnerable. We'll perform a ritual of exorcism and sealing. It will banish the entity and ensure Lily's soul can rest in peace." Ethan nodded, but Rachel hesitated. "And if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Michael's expression darkened. "Then the spirit will grow stronger, and if that happens, it won't just haunt Lily's grave, it will come for the living." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. She looked at Ethan, who was already standing, his jaw set with determination. "When do we start?" Ethan asked. "Tonight," Father Michael replied. "Gather your strength. You'll need it." The cemetery felt even colder and more foreboding than before. Ethan, Rachel, and Father Michael stood by Lily's grave, a circle of candles casting flickering light over the disturbed earth. The priest carried a crucifix, a vial of holy water, and the ancient book of prayers, his expression resolute. "Stay within the circle of light," Father Michael instructed. "No matter what happens, do not break the circle. The spirit will try to frighten you, confuse you, but you must remain strong." Ethan and Rachel nodded, though their hands were shaking. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. Father Michael began the ritual, chanting in Latin, his voice steady and commanding. The candles flickered wildly as the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "You should have let us rest." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the cemetery like a taunt. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay within the circle. The ground began to tremble, and the shadows around them seemed to stretch and twist, taking on nightmarish forms. Rachel let out a small cry as one shadow lunged toward her, but it couldn't breach the circle of candles. "Stay strong," Father Michael shouted, throwing holy water onto the grave. Steam rose from the ground as if it were burning, and the whispers turned into anguished screams. Then, with a deafening crack, the earth split open, and the shadowy figure from before emerged once again. Its form was even darker, more distorted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Ethan stared at it, frozen in place, as it spoke in that same haunting voice. "You cannot stop me. She is ours now." Father Michael raised the crucifix high, his voice growing louder as he continued the exorcism. The figure writhed, its smoky tendrils lashing out, but the circle held strong. "Ethan, focus," Father Michael shouted. "Think of Lily. Call her back." Ethan closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "Lily," he whispered, "if you can hear me, fight. Please, fight. Don't let it take you." For a moment the shadow hesitated. Its form flickered, as if it were losing strength. "Keep going," Father Michael urged, splashing more holy water onto the grave. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged toward the circle, but as the final words of the exorcism were spoken, it was pulled backward, its form dissolving into the ground. The candles flickered one last time before the cemetery fell silent. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. Rachel clung to him, trembling. "It's done," Father Michael said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's free." The silence in the cemetery was deafening. The air that had once been heavy with whispers and shadows now felt still, almost serene. Ethan knelt beside the grave, his hands trembling as he stared at the disturbed earth. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. "Is she really gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Father Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "Her soul is at peace now. The connection is severed. She's free." Ethan wanted to believe him, but a part of him still felt hollow. He turned his gaze to the spot where the shadow had emerged, his mind replaying the moment Lily's eyes had opened, blank and lifeless. Rachel knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "She's not suffering anymore, Ethan," she said softly. "That's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the stuffed bunny Lily had held in the coffin, its soft fur now worn and slightly dirty. He had grabbed it in the chaos, unable to leave it behind. "She loved this thing," Ethan murmured, his voice breaking. "It was her favorite." Rachel placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but firm. "She still loves you, Ethan. That hasn't changed. It never will." Father Michael began gathering his tools, his expression weary but calm. "There's one last thing we need to do," he said, breaking the silence. "We need to close the grave. The seal is complete, but leaving it open could invite other things." Ethan nodded, standing slowly. He felt drained, as if every ounce of his strength had been pulled from him. But he knew the priest was right. This chapter needed to be closed, literally and figuratively. Together, Ethan and Rachel helped Father Michael fill the grave. Each shovelful of dirt felt like a goodbye, a final act of love for the daughter Ethan would never hold again. When they finished, the cemetery was eerily quiet, the moon casting its pale light over the freshly packed earth. Father Michael stepped back, his hands clasped in prayer. "May her soul find rest, and may you find peace," he said solemnly. Ethan couldn't speak. He simply stood there, staring at the grave, the stuffed bunny clutched tightly in his hands. For a moment he swore he felt something, a faint warmth, a gentle presence. It wasn't frightening, it was comforting. "Lily?" he whispered, his voice cracking. A soft breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It wasn't cold or harsh, it was warm, almost like a hug. Ethan closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that it was her. Rachel touched his arm gently. "We should go," she said, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, but he didn't move right away. He knelt one last time, placing the stuffed bunny on the grave. "I love you, Lily," he whispered, "always." As they walked back to the car, the weight in Ethan's chest felt a little lighter. The pain of losing Lily would never fully go away, but he knew now that she was truly at peace. Ethan decided he couldn't stay in the house where he had raised Lily. Every corner of it was filled with memories, her laughter, her drawings on the fridge, the faint scent of her favorite strawberry shampoo. While those memories were precious, they were also unbearable. He found a small cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and silence. It was a place where he could start over, a place to heal. One afternoon, as he unpacked a box of Lily's belongings, he found a small wooden box he hadn't seen in years. Inside were her drawings, bright, colorful pictures of their life together. There were drawings of them at the park, baking cookies, stargazing in the backyard. Each picture was a snapshot of a happier time. Ethan smiled through his tears as he carefully unfolded the last drawing. It was one he didn't remember her making, a simple picture of the two of them holding hands under a big yellow sun. Above their heads, in her messy handwriting, were the words, "I'll always be with you, Daddy." His heart broke and healed all at once. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket. That evening, as the sun set and the wind rustled gently through the trees, Ethan sat on the porch of his new home. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. He couldn't explain it, but he knew Lily was there, not in the painful, haunting way she had been before, but in the warm, loving way he would always remember her. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Ethan looked up and whispered, "I'll always be with you too, sweetheart." The sun had set, and the world outside Ethan's new home was cloaked in darkness. He and Rachel sat silently in the car as they made their way back to the cemetery, accompanied by Father Michael. The priest's presence brought a faint sense of reassurance, but the weight of what they were about to face still pressed heavily on their shoulders. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was shaky, betraying the fear she was trying to hide. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of that horrifying night. The whispers, the shadow, the unrecognizable version of Lily that had stared back at him from the coffin. "I don't have a choice," he finally said. "If there's even a chance we can make sure she's at peace, I have to try." Father Michael nodded solemnly. "Tonight, we will seal the grave and ensure that the connection between her and the entity is completely broken. But you must understand, this will not be easy. It will fight back." The weight of those words hung in the air as the car pulled up to the cemetery gates. The chill of the night seeped into their bones as they stepped out, their breath visible in the cold air. The cemetery seemed darker than before, the moonlight barely illuminating the gravestones. Carrying candles, holy water, and the priest's ancient book of prayers, the trio approached Lily's grave. The earth was still disturbed from their earlier visit, the sight of it sending a fresh wave of unease through Ethan. Father Michael began arranging the candles in a circle around the grave, his movements deliberate and precise. "Once we start, do not break this circle," he warned. "No matter what you see or hear, you must stay inside. The entity will use your fear against you, but we cannot let it win." Ethan and Rachel nodded, though their hands trembled as they held each other for support. The priest lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the gravestones. He opened the book and began to chant in Latin, his voice steady and commanding. At first, the only sound was his prayer, but soon the air around them began to shift. A low, guttural whisper emerged from the grave, growing louder with each passing second. The wind picked up, swirling around them and making the flames dance wildly. "You should have left us," the voice hissed, echoing from all directions. Rachel gasped, clutching Ethan's arm as the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a dark mist began to rise from the grave, twisting and coiling like living smoke. "It's trying to break through," Father Michael said, raising his voice over the wind. "Stay strong." The priest continued the ritual, sprinkling holy water onto the grave. The mist recoiled at the touch, letting out a piercing shriek that made Ethan and Rachel cover their ears. Suddenly, the mist began to take shape. It rose higher, forming a shadowy figure with glowing eyes that radiated malice. The air grew icy, and Ethan felt as if the weight of the entity's presence was crushing him. "You cannot save her," the figure growled, its voice layered with anger and sorrow. "She is mine." "Lily isn't yours," Ethan shouted, stepping forward despite his fear. "She's my daughter." The shadow turned its gaze toward him, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw Lily's face within the darkness. Her eyes were pleading, her mouth forming the word, "Daddy." Ethan's heart shattered, but before he could move closer, Father Michael shouted, "Don't let it trick you, that is not her." The shadow lunged toward Ethan, but it couldn't penetrate the circle of candles. Father Michael raised the crucifix, chanting louder, his voice filled with power. The shadow screamed, its form twisting and writhing as if it were being torn apart. "Lily!" Ethan cried, tears streaming down his face. "If you're still in there, fight! Don't let it take you!" The shadow faltered, its movements growing erratic. For a brief moment the darkness seemed to retreat, and Lily's face became clearer. Her lips moved, and though no sound came out, Ethan could see the words, "I love you." Father Michael threw the last of the holy water onto the grave, shouting the final words of the exorcism. The shadow let out a final, deafening shriek before being pulled back into the earth. The ground trembled violently, and then silence. The candles stopped flickering, their flames now steady. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by an almost tangible sense of calm. "It's over," Father Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan fell to his knees, his body racked with sobs. Rachel knelt beside him, holding him tightly as tears streamed down her own face. "She's free," Rachel said softly. "She's finally free." Ethan didn't respond. He stared at the grave, the image of Lily's face lingering in his mind. Her final message to him, "I love you," played over and over. A bittersweet reminder of the daughter he had lost, but would never forget. Father Michael placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did what a father should do," he said. "You fought for her, and now she can rest." As they left the cemetery, Ethan glanced back one last time. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace. Whatever had haunted Lily was gone now, and though the pain of losing her would never fully fade, he knew he had done the right thing. Weeks passed, but the events of that night lingered in Ethan's mind like a distant storm, still and quiet, yet impossible to forget. Every so often he would replay the moment Lily's face had appeared in the shadow, her silent, "I love you," echoing in his heart. It wasn't a haunting memory anymore. It was a reminder of their unbreakable bond, a love that even death couldn't erase. Ethan had started a new life in the small cottage on the edge of town. The quiet was both healing and bittersweet. He had left behind the house filled with Lily's laughter, not because he wanted to forget her, but because the memories there were too vivid, too raw. Here, surrounded by the whisper of the trees and the gentle hum of nature, he could begin to heal. One chilly autumn morning, as the sun filtered through the golden leaves, Ethan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug soothed his hands, but his mind was elsewhere. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded drawing he had found weeks earlier, a picture of him and Lily holding hands, with her scribbled words, "I'll always be with you, Daddy." Tears filled his eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were a mix of pain and gratitude, of longing and love. He traced the drawing with his fingers, smiling faintly at her childlike handwriting. Suddenly, a breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves around him. It was warm and gentle, carrying a faint scent of strawberries, Lily's favorite shampoo. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Lily?" he whispered, barely daring to believe. The breeze lingered for a moment, circling him like a soft embrace. It wasn't cold or eerie. It was comforting, familiar, like a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him. "I love you too," he whispered, his voice trembling. When he opened his eyes, the breeze had gone, but the peace it left behind remained. Ethan looked up at the sky, now painted in soft hues of orange and pink, as the sun began to rise. From that day forward, Ethan found solace in the small signs around him. A bird landing on his windowsill, the sudden scent of strawberries in the air, the way the wind would brush past him at just the right moment. They weren't coincidences. They were Lily's way of reminding him that she was still there, watching over him. One evening, as he packed away the last of the boxes from his old life, Ethan found something he hadn't seen in years: Lily's old music box. It was dusty and slightly worn, but when he wound it up, the soft, tinkling melody played perfectly, filling the room with a bittersweet nostalgia. As the tune played, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time, a true sense of peace. He sat by the window, the music box in his hands, and watched as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "I'll be okay, Lily," he said softly. "You can rest now. I'll keep your love with me, always." And in that moment, Ethan knew that though his journey of grief wasn't over, he was no longer lost in it. Lily's memory wasn't a weight, it was a light guiding him forward. The wind whispered through the trees again, carrying with it a faint sound that made Ethan smile. It was her laughter. Not haunting or sad, but bright and full of life, just as he remembered. He looked up at the stars and whispered one last time, "Good night, sweetheart." The breeze brushed against his cheek like a kiss, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt whole. In the years that followed, Ethan never stopped thinking about Lily, but he also never stopped living. He dedicated his time to helping other grieving parents, sharing his story with those who felt lost in their pain. He told them about the love that never dies, the bonds that even death can't sever. And every time the wind brushed against him or the faint scent of strawberries filled the air, Ethan smiled, knowing that Lily was never truly gone. Her love lived on, in the memories they shared, in the lessons she taught him, and in the quiet, beautiful moments when the world seemed to pause, reminding him that she was still there, forever.